Disclaimer, this podcast is not meant to be a substitute for a session with a licensed therapist or mental health professional. We hope you learn more about what depression is, and resources will be listed in our description. Thoughts, views, and opinions shared are the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of a broader religious organization. Hello to all of our viewers and listeners. Today we are going to talk about the topic of depression on the second episode. And we have with us Dr. Vanessa Quintana, who has been a licensed marriage, family, and therapist. She currently practices as one and has her own practice. And she's been in the mental health field for 10 years now and is happily married and has 3 beautiful children. And the reason why we decided to invite her today was because, after or even during the pandemic, so many of us experienced new emotions, and it was something that none of us expected, right? Something that we had never really gone through. And so since our previous episode was on COVID-19 and spirituality, we decided that for this episode, we would kind of cover this topic of depression, because maybe for so many of us, whether Christian or if you go to church, or, even if you weren't going to church or were really affiliated, everyone, like I mentioned, everyone experienced some sort of new emotions. And, most likely it was something new, something that, we could definitely get more guidance on and get more information on. And we're so thankful that Dr. Vanessa agreed to share and just shed more light on this topic.
I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really important topic.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that we can discuss, right off the bat is, could you kind of go into what exactly is depression?
Yeah. So when I talk about depression as a licensed professional, I'm referring to a diagnosis, a mental illness, and that's major depressive disorder or postpartum depression or seasonal depression or depression that's been that has been there for a long time. And all of those have their own diagnosis, and that would be a clinical diagnosis versus what I often hear in layman's terms or around the community, I'm so depressed, for instance.
Right.
And that would be more referring to depressed mood or feelings. And that's valid as well. But the difference needs to be stated. Do we have a diagnosis? And in the topic of today, for the purposes of today's conversation, I will be talking through the lens of a therapist that sees it as a clinical diagnosis.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some of I guess you mentioned there's different diagnoses, right? There's SAD, seasonal affective disorder. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And each of those have their own symptoms. But what are some of the symptoms then that you see or maybe that are overlooked?
So there's certain criteria that needs to be met. And so to go away from more clinical terms, we often see that the symptoms that are most common are uncontrollable crying. We also see the isolation, the lack of empathy or care for things that I really did care about before. Maybe even disinterest. There's also suicidal thoughts. There's also self-harm, non-suicidal self-harm, such as cutting or increased exercise or dieting, with the purpose of doing damage to one's body or one's mind. And hopelessness, I think that's the one that I see the most or hear most often in my practice and in my work is, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't know how I can go on. I don't know what the purpose of this is. Those thoughts lead me to understand that there's something else going on, both emotionally or physically. The symptoms that are less common to notice are the ones that belong to certain groups of people. We focus most typically on female depression, interestingly enough, and we see the diagnosis and the symptoms through those eyes or that perspective, when in fact there's male depression that looks very different and has more physical symptoms. So the physical symptoms for depression in males might often look like a heart attack.
Oh, wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. So they might be going through a lot of pain in the chest or sweating or a lot of headaches or blurry vision or pain in different areas of their bodies. And they go to their physician and the physician's like, you don't have anything going on physically. And there's now a lot more training with physicians to let them know when it could be depression. So while it might be uncommon in the social circles, now it's becoming a lot more common to diagnose inside the medical circles. Also, child depression could look very different. A lot more anger, a lot more outbursts. You would expect to see maybe a teenager or a child being on their own, being really sad, crying, not eating, not sleeping, or sleeping too much, which is also other common symptoms, when in fact you could just see a child who is very hyperactive and is very upset and angry and yells and throws things and cannot control their emotions or is not very regulated. And that could also be depression.
Okay, so there's a variety of things, but I'm glad you mentioned that there's more training with the physicians, so that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it does boil down to a mental and a physical impact. I see the emotional impact of it or the mental impact, and I can diagnose that. But I know for sure there is a physical impact as well. And so when we look at these symptoms, we have to consider that the body's also responding to something.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. And so with this next question, is it normal to be Christian and depressed at the same time, or?
So depression has bled into all groups and subgroups of individuals, cultures, race, ethnicity, everything, socioeconomic status, gender, and age, everything. And within that specification is absolutely individuals who identify as Christian or agnostic or Buddhist. It doesn't have respect for those types of
So
boundaries.
nobody is exempt.
We're not, sadly enough. We're not. It's very much a pandemic in that way, depression. There are protective factors that individuals can count on, but there are individuals who are much more at risk because of where they come from or because of things that they have or don't have.
Okay. And I guess you can help us out with this next thought. So what might have been, or what is something that could trigger depression, or what causes depression in the first place?
I wish we knew. That's the $1 million question. There are so many factors that play into the presence and prevalence of depression. And some of the things that I could mention is genetics. So you could have a parent or a family member who struggled with depression and it was passed down to you. There are also certain types of personalities that are more vulnerable. There's also individuals who face trauma or crises that would be at risk for depression, or comorbid illnesses, which is other illnesses that present with the risk of depression, such as anxiety or addictions or physical illnesses. Individuals who are in poverty, individuals who have low education, individuals who are in neighborhoods of high crime, individuals who have faced life-threatening events, individuals who have faced abuse and other sort of very traumatic situations like that. So there's a number of things that could put individuals at risk.
Yeah, definitely. That's what I'm hearing from that list of things you just said, that there that it can be a variety of things.
It really can. Counting on the fact that sometimes it's not, sometimes it's hard to tell, and it's more of a Russian roulette type of situation where we're looking at a neurological imbalance and it's organic and everything else is absent. So it's harder to diagnose because we don't know where this comes from, and yet it exists.
Yeah. And what are some treatment options available for, those with depression?
I think there are 3 approaches we have to consider. The first approach would be a preventative approach to depression. The second approach would be an early intervention, and then the other one, which is less favorable, would be a late intervention, mid to late intervention. And the treatment options are different with each approach. So if we have a prevention approach, then we have good lifestyle and exercise and a good community support, et cetera, maybe self-care and reading, all of these things that help protect you from depression exist in the prevention stage. And there are a lot of things that we can do to prevent depression. There are. But if you're in a population at risk where there's very few things you can do to, control your environment or your genetics for that fact, then you would probably be looking at treatment options in early intervention where you're starting to see some of the things come up, some of the symptoms, and it's starting to get out of control or unusual for you and your personality and your maybe, lifestyle, then you would be looking at early intervention where the treatment options would be go to a therapist, go to community support or to support groups or books that are great in giving you information. The internet is full, plethora of articles and information sources with a lot of psychoeducation, psychologytoday.com, for instance, that you can do without going formally into therapy, which I'm biased as a therapist. Like, I really do think that therapy can be used as all 3 approaches: prevention, early intervention, and late intervention. I believe that if you have good mental hygiene, and that is visiting a therapist every so often or talking about other relationship things that you're struggling with, they might be able to catch that early on, or you might be doing a lot of the work to prevent it. However, with late intervention, we are looking at more intense treatment, pharmacological treatment, or inpatient hospitalization. There's a lot of more intense treatment in that category.
I like that you mentioned mental hygiene. I actually hadn't heard that term before, but it's something like just how we take care of ourselves. We eat at certain times, or, if you work out, you make that a priority. And I like that you said that because oftentimes we don't think about that in the preventative stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a client who was shocked out of the water when I mentioned that I had a therapist. Like, what? Like, you have a therapist? Yeah, I absolutely do have a therapist. Who would I be if I talked about the importance of it so much and did not engage in this type of care myself? I believe it. And I do attend, I do go, and I check in with them. I don't go continuously because the issues that I wanted to resolve, we've gone through different stages, and right now I'm in more of a as needed phase.
Right.
But knowing that I can count on that, knowing I have that to lean on, knowing that if something did come up, I'd have that, is already gives me a lot of mental peace. And so that's a lot of the hygiene as well. I know the dentist is there. I know I have a good relationship with him or her, and I know where to go, and I know that how much it costs, et cetera. All of those things to prepare yourself for crises, for instance, end up being great resources, which I think for the pandemic ended up being a negative feature for it. A lot of people were not prepared for the emotional impact that could have.
Yes,
The
definitely.
sociocultural events that took place around the pandemic, even without considering COVID, were very strong and impactful. We had the riots, we had the causes, right? We had the crises that were going on around
Natural
us.
disasters.
Natural disasters, absolutely. How many of us were prepared to call upon that resource? And I think that was lacking both in our field as professionals reaching out, as well as the stigma that exists around that prevented people from receiving care that they needed.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for touching up on that. This next question might be a little bit tougher, but do you think we should, this might go against everything that you've been stating, but are we supposed to just trust God that He will treat us, specifically with depression?
I believe that spirituality is a huge protective factor for individuals. I think it resides in the three approaches that we talked about as a preventative approach, as an early intervention. There are things like prayer and meditation and study and memorization of Bible scripture. There's also strong community support of individuals with like-mindedness. There's also attending something. There's purpose. There's mission. All of those things are elements that we use in the treatment of depression, prevention of depression, if it fits and it aligns with your beliefs and values. Absolutely. So I think that faith is strong towards aiding individuals. However, it has not been correlated as such that individuals that have high religiosity or high spirituality have absence of depression. Nor the other way around has it been correlated that individuals with absence of depression have super high religiosity. So in that way, without the evidence that shows that that is a factor, I'm hesitant to say that it is one. So for now, I know that there are so many things that impact depression. I know a lot of very strong faith individuals who I admire who have gone through mental illness. And personally, not professionally, but personally, I don't think that that goes against them. I don't think that it signifies the amount of faith that they have or not. I know that it builds resilience. You go through something like that, you talk about something like that, you witness to people who have that. And that's one of the things that Jesus talks about. When you go through something, a storm that you have, you can use that to rise up people around you. And that contributes to others' faith.
Yeah, wow, that's a great response. I think it almost gives us that hope too that okay, I do belong to this community, and there's others also going through tough times, and I can reach out. Like you said, it's
Absolutely.
very community based, and I love that you mentioned evidence based research, and well, that's another area to discover, right? So, so how can we reduce the stigma among Christians to, go and seek professional mental health?
I think what you're doing is already one step in the right direction, talking about it, hosting events like this, putting up billboards at your church, having resources available, talking about it in the pulpit, having the pastor talk about the struggles that human beings go through, that Christians go through, normalizing what it is like to go through things like this. And our language is very important. So let's stop calling it being crazy. Let's stop calling it, whatever else kind of has the connotation of we're abnormal or there's something broken and weird about us, and start normalizing it as something that we go through, something that we struggle through, and something that is important to have dignified approach to. So if I have a family member, don't hide it under the rug. Don't talk about it and gossip about it to everybody. Treat it like you would a physical illness. Get the help that you need at the moment, hopefully before you end up needing it severely. I see a lot of clients that have suicidality, that have a history of it, or are currently engaged in very severe suicidal ideation. And I noticed that one of the things that they lacked throughout their struggle was someone who said, I'm here. Someone who said, I might not understand, I might not have gone through that, but I want to know. I want to hear you. And individuals who have been isolated from their family, like immigrants, for instance, or individuals who have been pushed out of their communities because of something that they believe in or because of how they identify, struggle with depression, And how ironic is it that we would further cast them out when Jesus showed us that doing the opposite is building his kingdom? So in that way, how do we reduce the stigma? Go to therapy yourself. Even if you don't have depression, there's something going on in all of us that we can do better. And so talking about it more, posting on Facebook, maybe infographics, or Instagram or your social media accounts, infographics or information to normalize, to reach out. Post the suicide hotline number. At church, I would love to see more visual representation,
like flyers or,
exactly, of the things that we want to help our community with.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, we as a community can kind of create that safe space, right? And I know you said, having the pastor speak about it more, going to therapy ourselves. Are there any other ways?
Hosting events, having therapists or mental health professionals come to the church and do groups, or talking about it in different ministries, having someone available at the church to refer to, having people that the community can trust, that is aligned with the beliefs and values of that community, can also gain a lot of ground towards bridging the gap of those who will go, can go, are needing to go, but don't know where to go or who to go to, or if they can trust what is being said in therapy.
So, Dr. Quintana, what can you tell our viewers and listeners how they can create a safe space for someone who might come up to them and say, "Hey, I'm depressed." It's somebody who is coming for them for help.
Odds are is that in your lifetime you will have someone that says that to you. So we can start with language. What we say and what we don't say is crucial. We're responsible for that part of our relationship with people. So imagine coming up to someone in a very vulnerable state and hearing something like, "Oh, just think positive thoughts," or "Don't worry, it'll be over soon," or "Time heals all things," or "Let's just pray about it. Let's put it in God's hands." I'm being very careful because this language that we hear very often in our maybe church cultures that can bring a lot of hope to people. However, someone with depression, diagnosed with depression, struggles with the shame of depression. I can't control it. It's out of my control. I live this and I did not choose it. I did not go out and do all of these things, and I am still experiencing this. And so what you say to someone in that moment can have such a lasting impact. So changing it to, "I want to understand more. Let's take some time. I want to listen to you without interruptions. When can we meet?" Or when would you like me to check in on you? Or is it okay if I do? Or comments like, "I might not understand what you're going through, but I really care about you. And I want to be there with you. What can I do? How can I support you?" It's okay if the person doesn't know the answer to that. Oftentimes we don't know what we need or cannot communicate it very effectively sometimes, but maybe having a phone number really close at hand, in your phone, so that you can refer that and reach out to that person through that resource, or having an attitude that fits with the moment. So imagine someone coming in and saying, breaking maybe very courageously the silence and saying, "I'm going through this, help." And you saying something like, "Oh, okay, yeah, let's talk about it." It doesn't fit. So what we say, what we don't say, what we do, what we don't do. So dropping it in unannounced on someone can be very hard to deal with. A casserole might not be enough. It might not be enough for you, to receive text messages from someone all the time saying, how are you doing? How are you doing? How are you doing? All of those things could be adding to how difficult that situation might be. And asking permission, I think, is very appropriate. Oftentimes, we react to our emotional experience when someone tells us that. So we're very prone to feeling anxious or helpless when a situation like that happens, or we're scared that if we ask the wrong thing, it might give someone the wrong idea. It is untrue that if I ask someone about suicide, that it's going to encourage them to do it.
Oh, I've heard that.
Yeah,
yes.
it's a myth. It's needed to break the stigma, to ask about the things that are included in this very scary, dark hole that the person lives in. Have you thought about harming yourself? Have you thought about taking your life? The person might need to say it out loud. I have. How scary is that? I have. And you holding that, non-judgmentally holding that and saying, thank you for telling me. I care about you. What can we do together? You're not alone. I'm going to say this right out, might be a lot more effective and helpful than a therapist saying that to you, because there's a relationship there.
Right, there's some trust.
Exactly. So let's not sweep this under the rug. I would also encourage our churches, our community, our culture, our ethnicity. Don't sweep it under the rug. We often do this in hopes that it goes away. In fact, it does quite the opposite. Emotions are not absorbed. They're transformed. So instead of looking at a depressed mood, now we're looking at a clinical diagnosis. Now we're looking at diagnosis of depression and anxiety. Or we're looking at obsessive compulsive disorder alongside of it. Or we're looking at a psychosis. It can get scary. The more darkness there is around that, it gets scarier and scarier and scarier. So let's shed light on it. Let's bring hope. Let's answer the call. I believe God makes us when he says, tend my sheep. Who is going to be out there that can answer the call? And when we consider mental illness a part of our mission as individuals, as human beings, as Christians, in reaching out and sharing Jesus to others and building the kingdom, then I think that's the answer. Here I am, send me with my flyer. Here I am, send me with a text message. Here I am, send me with taking care of someone's kids while they go to a therapist. Here is, money for them to pay for therapy. I'm supporting an agency, a nonprofit organization that does mental health, or I'm inviting a guest speaker in to talk about these topics, or I'm starting a conversation, a panel. Here I am, send me, whatever that may look like with your personality. It doesn't have to be outside your comfort zone. It might be the calling to you with your experience and your strengths and your smile, and that might be your mission field, right? Reaching out to people with what God has given you as talents, working those in to compassion, empathy, etc. I think the further we go from our values as Christians, as human beings, the more we are at risk for mental illness. And we see others. It happens to others. It cannot happen to me. Pandemic showed us otherwise. Pandemic showed us that we were all going through this thing collectively, and it was building resiliency for some people. It was building community for others, but for other people, it was not. And it had nothing to do with their faith. It had to do with their status, their environment, their genetic code, etc. So in that point, if it can happen to them, it can happen to you. And what would you like? What would you like to have happened, right? For someone to respond in what way? And so if we do respond to our values and we adhere to our values to prevent mental illness, how congruent would it be to show compassion to someone who's struggling with depression? How congruent would it be? How amazing and transformative it would be to our community to show love for someone who voices that or doesn't. But I can observe and I'm willing to respond.
Yeah, and like you said, we are so unique, right? Each of us are so different, and we each have our own set of talents and strengths and weaknesses. And, we can use that and ask God, hey, use me in one way or another to help others as well.
Right.
And reflect His love. And that way, whenever somebody does come up to us, or even ourselves, we're experiencing that, we can, help in those ways that you mentioned. So thank you so much, Dr. Vanessa. We appreciate you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely.
And if anyone has any follow-up questions or comments, our email is in the description box, and we'll have Dr. Vanessa's contact information if anyone has specific questions for her. And we appreciate you for being with us today and just shedding more light on this topic.
My pleasure. Thank you.